In the autumn of 1944, as American forces began the reconquest of the Philippine Islands, they came under a new and terrifying form of attack. Japanese pilots had changed tactics and were determined to crash their aircraft onto an enemy ship so as to be sure of taking it with them. For the US crews, it was a shattering experience.
We thought we had the war won. And then when they began the kamikaze attacks, it scared the living daylights out of everybody.
I watched this plane come in. And it just kept on coming in. It was like slow motion almost, because he was firing his guns. I almost saw the projectiles hitting the deck. My body from my belt up was exposed above the flight deck, and the plane kept on coming in, and it didn't pull out. And I yelled, "Pull out, you bastard, pull out." I screamed it.
Over the next 8 months, more than 500 Allied ships were damaged or sunk, 5,000 crewmen killed, and almost as many wounded. As the Americans got closer to Japan itself, the attacks grew fiercer. It was a foul taste of the carnage which might happen if the imperial home islands had to be invaded. Most of the kamikaze were barely out of their teens. Their methods were born of desperation, but they rose out of the very core of the Japanese military tradition. During the Middle Ages, a breed of warrior was born in Japan known as the samurai. They followed the Bushido, or Way of the Warrior, code. This laid down that a samurai owed total loyalty and obedience to his lord, and must be ready to die for him or the emperor, who was regarded as a god. Any samurai who did so would enjoy reincarnation. The cult of Bushido resurfaced after World War I, as Japan grew increasingly militaristic. This was in reaction to widespread corruption, which had accompanied attempts to introduce a democratic system. Many younger people were disillusioned, and army officers in particular demanded a return to traditional values. Japan was also undergoing a population explosion, which stretched the economy to the limit. And because the country was almost totally reliant on the import of raw materials, unemployment and poverty soared, made worse by the Great Depression, which began in 1929. The military saw overseas expansion as the only solution, and in the early 1930s, Japan annexed Manchuria to provide more living space. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese attacked China. It was the beginning of a war that would last for 8 long years. The Japanese army soon began to show the worst aspects of Bushido: utter contempt for its enemies and total ruthlessness in conducting the war. Atrocities against the Chinese, especially civilians, became commonplace and shocked much of the world. The military, however, ignored international protests, declaring that they were the servants of their emperor, Hirohito, whom they continued to regard as a god who could do no wrong. They also used this pretext to increase their influence over the government. In July 1940, General Hideki Tojo became defense minister, enabling the military to gain almost total power. He influenced the government to adopt a hardline attitude to the Western democracies, who were bitterly opposed to what Japan was doing in China. In retaliation, President Roosevelt of the United States placed a limited embargo on the export of raw materials to Japan. Its government faced the choice of caving in to international demands or taking action to seize its own resources, particularly of oil and rubber, which abounded in Southeast Asia. The idea of a Japanese-controlled Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was born. This was intended to cover the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Thailand, Burma, and the Philippines. The Japanese recognized that the powerful US Pacific Fleet was the main obstacle to these expansion ambitions. So plans were drawn up to destroy it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the strike on the American base at Pearl Harbor, had no illusions that the United States industrial might would enable her to recover in 6 months. But he reckoned this would be long enough to establish the new Japanese empire. After that, Japan's only hope of long-term survival lay in America accepting that war with Japan would be too costly and bloody. Yamamoto was right in his calculation that the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere could be established in 6 months. Between the initial attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 and May 1942, the Japanese overran all their objectives. The Japanese armed forces had proved that they were more than a match for Western troops. But the Bushido Code made them careless of their lives, often mounting suicidal charges. Japanese soldiers were also indoctrinated with the belief that to surrender to the enemy was a disgrace. As a result, their treatment of prisoners of war was brutal in the extreme and totally disregarded the Geneva Conventions. But this seemed of little concern in the spring of 1942. It was a time of euphoria for Japan. Her armed forces seemed invincible, and young Japanese went willingly into the army and navy, desperate to share in the glory. The tide of war turned swiftly against the Japanese. In June 1942, they attacked the Pacific island of Midway, 1,200 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. But the Americans had broken their codes and already knew of the plan. The carriers of the US Pacific Fleet were ready to strike. In the battle that followed, the Americans destroyed all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers deployed against them. The cream of the Imperial Navy went up in smoke. Two months later, the Americans began to strike back. Their forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomons. The Japanese did not oppose the initial landings, but they were not prepared to give up the island without a struggle, and it took 6 months of bitter fighting for the Americans to secure Guadalcanal. The Americans then advanced northwards through the Solomons, but on every island the Japanese resistance was increasingly bitter. It was the same in the Central Pacific, where another American advance got underway.
I thought they were very cruel, they were sadistic, and they wanted to die for their emperor, and we had to go out there and help them die for the emperor.
Time and again, the Japanese fought on until the bitter end, with only the badly wounded taken prisoner. Banzai suicide charges became increasingly frequent. By July 1944, the US forces had reached the Marianas Islands, from which their massive B-29 bombers could attack mainland Japan. Japanese now began to show their growing desperation in another way.
それで、覚悟を決めて延べただいまから体当たりというふうな無線を打ちましてね。でそのままその防衛の編隊長、6機9機の長機に、ぶつかったわけですね。
The B-29s were brought crashing to the ground. The two Japanese pilots achieved their ambition of dying in defense of their homeland. Others soon followed their example. This determination to die in battle was about to be formalized as a new and terrible Japanese weapon. In October 1944, the American forces in the Pacific were poised to liberate the Philippines. The islands represented the junction between Admiral Chester Nimitz's drive across the Central Pacific and that by General Douglas MacArthur up through the islands of the Southwest. Recognizing the threat, the Japanese now drew up a plan for the defense of the inner ring of islands that protected mainland Japan. These ran from the Kuril Isles in the north down to the Dutch East Indies. The plan was called Operation Show, or Victory, and called for large-scale attacks by sea and air on the landings as soon as they took place. The still powerful Japanese combined fleet was now based in the Dutch East Indies, close to its main source of fuel. It could certainly reach the Philippines in good time. Admiral Takejino Onishi's first air fleet was ordered to mount the air component of Operation Show as soon as the Americans invaded the Philippines. Simultaneously, the combined fleet would attack the American ships supporting the landings with two powerful groups of battleships and its remaining carriers. Japanese air power had suffered catastrophic losses since the beginning of 1944. Onishi was left with only 60 aircraft, not nearly enough to make an impression on the American fleet. To get through the US defenses with maximum effect, he drew up a plan which would reflect the Bushido Code in its purest form. Onishi's inspiration was a fellow naval aviator, Admiral Masabumi Arima. As the US fleet approached the Philippines in mid-October 1944, Arima had led his air group in a banzai attack against it. He deliberately dived his plane on the carrier USS Franklin and severely damaged it. Onishi decided that such suicide attacks were the only way to deal with the wooden-decked US carriers. These were the key element of the Allied Armada, since they provided the essential air power to support the landings. But his attacks needed to be organized rather than carried out haphazardly. Onishi called for volunteers among his pilots to form a special attack unit. He called it Kamikaze, or Divine Wind, after the typhoon which had devastated a Mongol invasion of Japan in the 13th century. Some of Onishi's officers had doubts at first about what the response would be.
誰も変えてこなかったらどうしようかと思ったわけです。ところが専任の下士官がその封筒に入れて書いたのを持ってきました。調べてみたらば3つだけ白紙が入っとって、あとは全部 希望ということ。
Onishi's pilots considered it an honor to be given the opportunity to strike a mortal blow against their enemies and to die for their emperor. They were soon put to the test. On the 20th of October 1944, US forces landed on Leyte in the central Philippines. A beachhead was quickly secured. The Japanese immediately put Operation Show into action. But American submarines spotted the combined fleet west of the Philippines. They engaged it with torpedoes. This marked the beginning of a sustained sea and air attack against the Japanese ships. Two carriers were sunk before they could reach the US landing site. It was now that Onishi launched the first of his kamikaze attacks. But because his planes lacked radar and visibility was poor, they failed to locate the US fleet. On the 25th of October, Onishi tried again. 5 Kamikaze Zero fighters with 4 escorts took off. They spotted the US escort carriers supporting the forces on shore, and the kamikazes immediately dived on them. Despite intense defensive fire, 4 of the 5 aircraft hit their targets. The escort carrier St. Lo was sunk, and 3 others badly damaged. An elated Onishi ordered another attack for the following day. This damaged 2 further carriers, but by this time the Japanese fleet was in full retreat. Three battleships and its last 4 carriers had been sunk. Kamikazes seemed the only weapon left in the Japanese armory which was capable of turning back the growing threat to the homeland. The call went out for more kamikaze units to be raised. The High Command recognized that the few experienced combat pilots who remained were too valuable to be frittered away. They therefore targeted flight training schools. After all, they reasoned, the kamikaze pilot only had to fly his aircraft to the target. He did not need the additional air combat training. As Japan's situation became ever more desperate, the training schools intensified the indoctrination of their students in the Bushido Code to make them willing volunteers. It was very effective.
All the fighter pilots, about 150 of us at the training base, were called in. A senior officer, the head of the troop, told us they were recruiting people for a special mission.
Sometimes entire classes of students volunteered. They were given basic instruction on how to attack Allied ships. Most of the volunteers were clear about their motivation.
特に動物っていうものは死というものは嫌うし、死を前にしたら逃げますね。ただ、 逃げてはいられないその精神的な責任とか道義とかというものがあった時に自分の命を捧げると。
それと国なり民族のために命を捨てるということは、最高の名誉あることだと、考えられていたわけです。これは私だけじゃありません。誰でもほとんどがそうです。建前としてですね。
But as US forces fought their way across the Philippines, they found that kamikaze was not just restricted to air attacks. Apart from banzai charges, Japanese troops would strap grenades or mines to themselves and attack tanks, knowing that they would be blown up in the process. Kamikaze was becoming widespread. By the beginning of 1945, the Americans had secured the major islands of the Philippines. Their attention now turned to the volcanic outcrop of Iwo Jima, which the Japanese had been using to mount some of their kamikaze air attacks. They also wanted to secure the island so that the B-29 bombers attacking Japan from the Marianas could be provided with escort fighters. US Marines landed on Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945. Their enemy was well entrenched in an extensive network of underground defenses. The Marines were quickly involved in a grim struggle. The ships supporting the landing soon came under kamikaze attack. They sank the escort carrier Bismarck Sea and badly damaged the massive fleet carrier Saratoga. The anti-aircraft armament on the American ships had been strengthened since the previous autumn, and many more kamikaze planes were shot down before they could inflict damage. The tactics employed by the Japanese also played into the American hands. Instead of concentrating on a particular ship, kamikaze pilots were given individual targets. This enabled the ship's guns to concentrate on just one plane, rather than having to combat simultaneous attacks from different directions. Fortunately for the Allies, no kamikaze pilots survived to point out this tactical error. It took a month to secure Iwo Jima. Often, only flamethrowers were capable of destroying the Japanese soldiers in their underground bunkers. The campaign to take Iwo Jima cost the Americans nearly 30,000 casualties. This included some 7,000 killed. Of the 20,000 Japanese defenders, less than 1,000 survived to become prisoners of war. But Iwo Jima paled almost into insignificance when compared to the next Allied objective, Okinawa, the last island bastion guarding the route to mainland Japan. The Japanese knew that Okinawa was the last stepping stone barring the way to the home islands, and were determined to defend it to the last. The 110,000 men of the 32nd Army did not intend to fight the Americans on the beaches, but instead forced them to pay dearly in attacks on a series of well-concealed fortifications. The Japanese had also widened their range of kamikaze weapons. One was the Oka, or cherry blossom, a purpose-built piloted bomb. This was rocket-powered and had a 2,650-pound warhead. The Oka was carried beneath a bomber and released close to its target. There could be no turning back for the Oka pilots.
特に大方隊の場合はもう19年の10月に絶対死ぬということで明日出るかも分かんないという状態で、来たのが、終戦まで続いてるもんですからちょうど死刑囚が死刑の宣告をされて死刑を待っているような心境ではありましたよね。
The Japanese had also developed an attack boat similar to those of the Italians, which could be aimed at an enemy ship. But in their case, it was not intended that the pilot would bail out. Scores of these craft were waiting at secret bases on Okinawa. More sophisticated was the Kaiten, or Heaven Shaker, which was a midget submarine based on the highly successful Lance torpedo, modified to incorporate a crew compartment and conning tower to enable it to be steered to its target. In theory, the pilot could evacuate the vessel just before it reached its target.
確かに大変ですね。
It certainly was extremely difficult. First of all, there were no safety devices at all. It was like being put inside an oil drum, spun round and round until you were dizzy.
The Kaiten were to be carried close to their targets by submarine and were designed to be launched underwater. Kamikaze attacks against the Okinawa invasion fleet began in March 1945. On the 19th, Kamikazes made their first successful interception. They struck the carrier Wasp and, for the second time, the Franklin. Both vessels were severely damaged, and 900 crewmen killed. The first operation by the Oka piloted bombs took place 2 days later. It was a disaster. The weight of the rockets made their mother bombers slow and unmaneuverable. US fighters were able to intercept them and shoot all of them down. On the 1st of April, the Americans made their initial landings on the west coast of Okinawa. They were surprised to meet no opposition on the beaches and began to advance inland. 3 days after the landings, the Japanese launched a mass kamikaze raid of more than 350 planes against the shipping off the beaches. Intense US firepower turned it into a massacre, with only one carrier, Bellow Wood, slightly damaged. On the 4th of April, the Japanese began what was effectively the greatest kamikaze mission yet. The mighty battleship Yamato set off with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa, where she was to be beached to act as a gun battery. She never made it. US carrier planes sent her to the bottom. The explosive motorboats also met with little success. None got within range of an American ship, and several of their anchorages were overrun before they could be used. The sinking of an oil tanker, the USS Mississiniwa, was credited to the Kaitan, but more often they were intercepted while still with their mother craft. Even so, Japanese propaganda claimed that numerous Allied battleships were being destroyed. The Japanese people were led to believe that a great victory was about to be snatched from the jaws of ultimate defeat. The kamikaze air attacks continued. The US crews were resorting to desperate tactics.
The way we stopped them was just to fill the air with flak. And if there was ever an opening in the flak, they were on you. And we had a number of them just barely miss us at Okinawa.
The attacks came in all round the clock. There was no respite. In spite of increasing losses, ever more volunteers stepped forward for the kamikaze units.
ただ出る前に作戦主任の中島中佐という作戦主任の方がね、無駄死にはするなと。とにかくダメだったら帰ってこいと。機会はいくらでもあるんだと。
By now, the preparations for a kamikaze attack had become a ritual. The members of an attack unit were usually told of their mission the previous night. This gave them time to mentally prepare themselves and to write last letters to their loved ones. Second Lieutenant Shigeyuki Suzuki wrote of, "The great day that we can be directly in contact with the battle is our day of happiness, and at the same time, the memorial of our death." Isao Matsuo said to his parents, "Please congratulate me. I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. This is my last day. The destiny of our homeland hinges on the decisive battle in the seas to the south, where I shall fall like a blossom from the radiant cherry tree." On the day of their last and fatal mission, the kamikaze pilots donned white scarves or headbands, the samurai symbol for revenge. They would then drink a farewell glass of sake rice wine with their comrades. Then came the last short walk to their aircraft.
それがトラックに乗って列車に向かう時のトラックの上から流れてくるわけですけども、ちょっと待ってください。緑小島のふるさとよさらば、白いハンカチ振るてよさらば、ちりり彦棒に菜の花さして、ああ空は男の行くところ。
On Okinawa, the American forces fought a grim battle to break through the various fortified lines in the south. But in contrast to previous campaigns, Japanese soldiers did begin to surrender voluntarily as the weeks of fighting wore on. At least some of them had begun to realize that the war was lost, and the Bushido Code had no further relevance. But those who allowed themselves to become prisoners of war were still a small minority. Most Japanese soldiers simply fought on until they were killed. Many of the civilians on Okinawa had been so indoctrinated by their country's propaganda that they were convinced that the Americans would show them no mercy. Some chose to jump off cliffs, even clutching their children, rather than be taken alive. All the time, the supply of kamikaze pilots seemed inexhaustible. But eventually, the Americans broke through the final defense line. As many others had done before him, the Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, committed suicide on the 22nd of June. His death marked the end of almost 3 months of bitter combat. During the battle for Okinawa, 2,394 kamikaze pilots and their planes were lost. They sank 28 Allied ships and damaged a further 368. The Divine Wind sacrifice had not been enough to blunt the progress of the Allies, whose next objective was the Japanese home islands themselves. Given their experience on Okinawa, it appeared an awesome prospect. By July 1945, Japan was in a desperate situation. A highly successful American submarine campaign had throttled maritime communications. Few raw materials were now getting through. B-29s, now joined by B-17s and carrier-based aircraft, were remorselessly bombing the home islands. Japan's cities were being systematically destroyed. Ultimate defeat appeared imminent. Some members of the Japanese government realized this and were attempting to put out peace feelers to the Allies. But the military was still in charge and refused to consider surrender. Instead, they were preparing to resist an Allied invasion. Suicide weapons would play a major role. Ever more kamikaze pilots were being trained. Thousands of explosive motorboats were being prepared. More Kai-10 human torpedoes were being built. The whole Japanese population was being mobilized and indoctrinated to resist to the last. "28 million civilians had been enrolled in a new militia to fight alongside the 2.3 million troops and 4 million naval and army civilian employees. All of these preparations were being monitored by Allied intelligence. This map of the special suicide formations was based on information gained at Britain's Bletchley Park Code-Breaking Centre, and is on display there. Some diehards amongst the military even suggested a mass suicide charge by the entire population, men, women, and children. It was with this in mind that the Allies began to draw up plans for the final assault. The initial attack was to be mounted on the 1st of November 1945 against Kyushu, the southernmost of the Japanese main islands. This would be followed by a second assault in Tokyo Bay in March 1946. Painfully aware of the Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the knowledge that the people of Japan were likely to sell their lives even more dearly when their homeland was invaded, the Allies were certain that their invading forces would suffer heavy casualties, especially from kamikaze attacks. Around 1 million dead were forecast. There was, however, an alternative, which could bring the war to a speedy end. Deep in the Alamogordo Desert, New Mexico, an atomic bomb was exploded on the 16th of July. Knowing this, the Allied leaders issued Japan with a demand for unconditional surrender. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government rejected the demand because it insisted on unconditional surrender and made no mention of the fate of Emperor Hirohito. Faced with this, the Allies believed that they had no choice but to use the awesome destructive power of the atomic bomb. The first was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on the 6th of August. When no positive Japanese response was received, a second was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. The Japanese Supreme Council was now deadlocked between the civilian members who wanted to sue for peace and the military who were determined to fight on until the end. Eventually, both parties agreed that the emperor should be consulted. Hirohito realized that his people had suffered enough. In order to prevent a military coup, he took the unprecedented step on the 14th of August of broadcasting Japan's acceptance of the Allied demands. Two weeks later, the Japanese signed the instrument of surrender in a ceremony presided over by General Douglas MacArthur on board the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The dropping of the atomic bombs has been a matter of intense debate since 1945. A major reason for the action was the fear of unacceptable Allied casualties if Japan had to be invaded, and the knowledge that kamikazes would be a major cause of these. The thousands of idealistic young Japanese men who volunteered to follow the ultimate demand of the Bushido Code were undoubtedly gladiators of great courage. But they were also victims of a self-destructive ideology. Some have accused them of selfishness in wanting to prolong a war that Japan could not win, for the sake of securing their places in heaven. Their fanaticism had blinded them to the ultimate consequences of their actions. In Japan today, there is a kamikaze museum. Today's young Japanese visit it to try to understand what drove their forebears to do what they did. The families of the kamikazes, and the ever-dwindling band of those who volunteered but were not called, continue to revere the memory of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Many others view this episode in Japan's history as an aberration, one that is best forgotten. Despite their courage, the kamikazes could not prevent the inevitable.